Good evening. My name is Molly Anderson, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Nantucket Atheneum. This is our fourth talk this summer for the Geschke lectures. And first, a bit of housekeeping. If you could turn off your cell phones, please. Any gentlemen that wore jackets could remove their jackets if they're so inclined. And there will be a book sale of Dr. Haass's book and a signing after the presentation in the foyer. And one side is book sales, the other side is signing, so you can make your choices as you leave. The Geschkes have been such generous people for our community, and nights like tonight would not happen if they hadn't had the vision to understand that this Nantucket has always been a community that's been interested not just in local affairs, but international affairs. And they've made it possible for us to have the caliber of speaker that we're going to enjoy tonight. So first I would like to thank the Geschkes, and I hope you will join me. And now Chuck is going to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. You're much too kind, but thank you very much from both Nan and me. Well, I'm especially pleased this evening to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker, Dr Haass. He's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a position he's held since July of 2003. And prior to this, he was the director of policy and planning for the U.S. Department of State and a close advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He succeeded George Mitchell as the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland to help the peace process in that country, for which he received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. Dr. Haass has had an exceptionally distinguished career, as if those first few items weren't enough already. From 1989 to 1993, Haass was Special Assistant to the United States President George H.W. Bush and National Security Council Senior Director for the Far East and South Asian Affairs. In 1991, Haass received the Presidential Citizens Medal for helping to develop and explain U.S. policy during Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. Previously, he served in various posts in the Department of State from 1981 to 85 and the Department of Defense from 1979 to 80. But I'm not done. Haass's other positions have included Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute, the Saul M. Limowitz Visiting Professor of International Studies at Hamilton College, a Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a lecturer in Public Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Haass is a Rhodes Scholar. He obtained his BA from Oberlin College in 1973 and went on to earn both a Master of Philosophy and a Doctorate of Philosophy from Oxford University. So I think you can see pretty quickly that we're excited to hear what Dr. Haass will have to talk to us about this evening. And his talk will be focused around his recently released book entitled A World in Disarray, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis of the Old Order. Please give him a warm Nantucket welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck, and thank you all for being here. I expect there's one or two alternatives tonight here in Nantucket. And in approximately an hour, the president's going to go on national television to talk about one of the things we'll talk about here, which is Afghanistan and U.S. policy there. It's great to be back here. And let me warn you in advance, this is not the happiest of subjects. If you write a book called The World in Disarray, it's probably not a stocking stuffer. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about this world we live in. And to cut to the chase, if you're not worried, you should be. I want to talk about this world. I want to talk about how we got here. I want to talk about why it matters that this is a world in disarray. And then the last bit, because it's not hopeless, and there's very little that's inevitable about history. It wasn't inevitable that we got here. It's not inevitable that we end up in any particular place. I want to talk a little bit about what we might do about it, some do's and don'ts. And then, unlike people from Washington, I promise not to filibuster. I'll keep it relatively short because there's so many of you, and I'd love to hear your comments or questions. So I'll be uncharacteristically succinct. One, world in disarray. I'm not going to belabor the point because it's everywhere. The Middle East essentially has unraveled across more fault lines than any of us can count. One of the ways I think the Middle East is in bad shape when Lebanon is one of the most stable states in the countries in the region. That tells you a lot. But there's problems within states, there's civil wars, there's proxy wars, there's regional wars, there's global actors, you've got failed states, you've got the situation in Syria, the situation in Libya, the situation in Yemen, you still have the Israeli-Palestinian situation, you've got an Iran nuclear agreement that parks the problem but doesn't resolve it. I mentioned Afghanistan, which is part of the greater Middle East. One could have an entire conversation about that, and that really would be depressing. So I won't, but I simply want to say that one thing is obviously the Middle East. Europe. Well, Europe, Ronald Reagan proclaimed that Europe was whole and free, and when the Cold War ended a quarter of a century ago, people wrote books about the end of history. Well, history has returned to Europe. We once again have geopolitics in Europe. We see it with the Russian takeover of Crimea and what they're doing in eastern Ukraine. There is also the fact that one of the great pieces of post-World War II statecraft, the European Union, is now in quite a lot of uncertainty given Brexit and what that's going to mean for Europe. You've got the flows of refugees into Europe that have challenged traditional politics. So again, you've got a part of the world that we thought was almost taken care of, that suddenly its future is more than a little in doubt. Asia's been the stunning miracle of the world. You've had extraordinary economic growth in China, but also throughout the region. You've got the world's second and third largest economies there with China and Japan. Decades of high levels of economic growth throughout the region. Now India is growing at 7 or 8%. But, and it's a big but, the stability of Asia has rested on three things. And all three of these now are suspect. One was, and we'll talk about this again, is the stability of the Korean Peninsula. And suddenly there's this vestige of World War II, rather than looking relatively stable, is suddenly anything but. And you've got a North Korea that now is far along in the development, not just of nuclear weapons, it's got dozens of those, but it's now got the missiles that can travel across the world with increasing accuracy to reach all sorts of places in the United States. So you've got the Korean question, you've got a China that is increasingly assertive in the region. For decades, the Chinese philosophy was let's keep things calm on the outside so we can develop on the inside. Well, now in China, there's powerful voices questioning that. And third, the United States was in Asia, close to our allies, in Japan and South Korea, and elsewhere, Australia, the Philippines, and we were the stabilizer of the region. But now, one of the first things that Donald Trump did when he was president was took the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was this regional trade and security agreement that the United States was in with many of our allies. And what it has done is raise questions about whether the United States will be prepared to continue the sort of role that has kept the peace and stability of Asia. We can talk about Latin America with Venezuela. We can talk about Africa with South Sudan if you want. The only other thing I'd add to the disarray is at the global level. We live in a world in which globalization is a reality. Things flow across borders, tremendous speed, tremendous volume, and the ability of the world to cope with these flows is increasingly suspect. We've seen a dramatic demonstration of that in cyberspace. There's virtually no rules in cyberspace. And to the extent there are rules, who polices them? Who enforces them? So countries, among other things, interfere in the domestic politics of other countries, including our own. Russia obviously did this, but what's the effect? And you have attacks taking place, you have theft of intellectual property, and you've had the Chinese got inside the Office of Personnel Management, and approximately 15 to 20 million files with all sorts of details of Americans was found out by China. I remember one day getting a little letter that you should be aware, from the US government, that your file was one of the 20 million or so that was compromised. So what are the rules here? Because the internet does tremendously good things. How do we promote the good and how do we discourage the bad? Easier articulated as a challenge than put into place as an answer. And we could talk about other issues from refugees to climate change. And my basic point is you constantly hear this phrase, international community. Well, the deep, dark secret of international relations is there's very little community. So you add all this up, and I think that the case that this is a world in disarray is quite strong. And when I was introduced, it was mentioned that I worked for President Bush the father. One of his most famous speeches 25 or so years ago is he stood up before Congress and he talked about a new world order where the rule of the jungle would be replaced by the rule of law. Well, now 25 years later, it doesn't look so good. And the trend lines, the arrows have not gone the way many of us would have wanted them to go. So I think the argument that things are not going great in the world, indeed, if there were a share of stock called State of the World, it would have suffered something of a correction or worse over the last 25 years. So I'll just posit that. If you want to take me on that, have at me. I'd love to be more optimistic than I am, so I'd love to be proven wrong on this point. How did we get here? A couple of reasons. One is simply the stuff of history. Countries rise, things happen. In this day and age, there's all sorts of capacity and all sorts of hands. And you don't have to be a state to matter now. Look at groups like Al-Qaeda, look at groups like ISIS. So the chessboard is crowded with all sorts of actors and entities, states and non-states alike, that can make a difference for better, but also for worse. The second thing is globalization. I mentioned that you've got these enormous flows, whether they're computer viruses or biological viruses, but the ability of the world to shape and control these flows is limited. The flows are stronger than the ability of us to cope with them. We probably came within 48 hours of having a global pandemic on Ebola. Probably within 48 hours of a global breakout and a total breakdown of the system of international health. Next time we may not be so lucky. Climate change is happening because the willingness and ability of the world to contend with it is, shall we say, limited. We can go on to issue after issue after issue. The institutions that were created after World War II, the United Nations, the World Bank, and others, that's 70 years ago. If we handed out pencil and paper here, and I asked you all to design a United Nations Security Council, I would bet all the money I didn't lose at the golf course today, I would bet that not one of you would come up with the UN Security Council we have. The idea that countries like Britain and France are permanent members of the Security Council with vetoes, but countries like Germany, Japan, India, and others aren't on the Security Council. This is what people 70, 75 years ago thought the world was going to look like. It's changed. It's changed dramatically. Or take the NAFTA agreement. NAFTA agreement's about 25 years old. It's just the renegotiation started. Put aside for a second Mr. Trump's opposition to many trade agreements. One of the things the NAFTA agreement never considered was digital commerce. Well, there was a good reason. There wasn't digital commerce 25 years ago when NAFTA was negotiated. It's just another example about how some of the instruments that have served us well, they have sell-by dates. And our ability to keep them up to date, again, is quite limited. So some of the things that explain why the world's messy are just the stuff of history, but also we've added to it. And by we, I mean the United States, and we're not just any other country. The United States came out of World War II, came out of the Cold War as by far the most powerful and influential country in the world. So what the United States chose to do and chose not to do had outsized impact. And I think if one looks at George W. Bush, his presidency, many good things one could point out, but I think history will be understandably critical or worse about the Iraq War and all that did to upset whatever limited equilibrium there was in the Middle East. And what it did in many ways was make the Middle East safe for Iranian influence, and it greatly exacerbated the tensions between Sunnis and Shias, and a lot of what we're seeing in the Middle East now can be traced back to that. And then Barack Obama came into office, determined not to make the mistakes of his predecessor, and as is so often the case in history, he overreacted. So he would announce things like, well, there's a red line, and if the Syrian government were ever to use chemical weapons in Syria, there'd be a large price to pay. The Syrian government went ahead, proceeded to use chemical weapons, and there was no price to pay. And that had all sorts of repercussions for the Syrian civil war, which in turn had all sorts of repercussions for the region and for Europe, given refugee flows, had all sorts of repercussions for perceptions of the United States about whether we could be trusted, whether our word meant anything. The United States intervened in Libya, didn't follow it up, and the idea that Libya would just somehow sort itself out after a ruler who had been in place for 4 decades had been removed, you'd have to be an optimist on steroids. Things almost never sort themselves out. You know, Adam Smith, for those of you who took Economics 101, was very big on the idea on the invisible hand of the marketplace. It may or may not work in economics. It decidedly does not work in geopolitics. Often you need a very visible hand of the United States to help sort things out. And what we did often in the last administration is we would take away the old order, however flawed or imperfect it may have been, but we often were not prepared to put a new one in its place. So this combination of the stuff of history and American acts of commission and omission, more than anything else, have added to this much messier world. Why does it matter? The short answer is that in a world of globalization, there's no such thing as local. You can have, on a poultry farm in Indonesia, you can have a breakout of a virulent strain of some kind of a virus through people consuming that chicken. It can then get on the pathway of globalization and reach here. We saw it with Ebola. We see it with climate change. It doesn't matter where the coal plants are operating, because that's about pollution. But climate change is the sum total of what we put out there and its impact on the world. So one thing is nothing is local. So the United States, we can't become a giant gated community. We can't build a moat around the United States and somehow wall ourselves off from the effects, whether it is of climate change, whether it is of disease, or I mentioned North Korea. Here's this country, one of the poorest countries in the world, the most closed country in the world, but suddenly we are very close to having to live with the risk that North Korea, if it so decided, could kill millions of Americans. It's another example in which, again, what happens out there doesn't stay there. It either does come here or it potentially comes here. Or things like trade. More than 10 million American jobs are dependent on the ability to export overseas. And if we lose that ability to export, think about what it would mean for the American economy and for people either in this room or people you surely know. So my point is simply that if the world begins to unravel, it will have real implications for us. We can't wall ourselves off from it, no matter how much we might like to. Even in the Middle East, you've got things like terrorism that can obviously reach it. And the lesson of 9/11 is what? That a bunch of people living in Afghanistan, where the government was too weak or unwilling to control them, could get on planes armed with box cutters and kill 3,000 people in the United States. Again, it's a message that nothing stays local for long, so we need to have an active foreign policy, which leads me to the fourth thing I want to talk about, which is what do we do about it? What can we realistically do about this world where, again, the arrows are pointing increasingly in the wrong direction, with implications for our standard of living, for our security, for our quality of life. Let me take it in a couple of ways, and then again, we'll go to whatever it is you want to talk about. In places like the Middle East, we still have important interests. Yes, we're self-sufficient in energy, but the world still depends upon Middle Eastern energy, and we still depend upon our economic relationships with the world. So we can't ignore the Middle East. We ignore it at our peril. There's energy. There's our special commitment to Israel. There's concerns about terrorism. There's concerns about proliferation. So we can't wash our hands of the Middle East as much as we might sometimes want to. On the other hand, we've also got to be realistic about what we can't do. I don't think we can recreate the Middle East in our image. I think in foreign policy, there is at times a need for some humility, some modesty, and it's very much at the heart of what the president's going to be talking about tonight in Afghanistan. So let me just relate it to what he's going to be talking about in a few minutes, which is, should we be content with a policy towards Afghanistan that would simply try to keep the terrorists at bay there? Or should we try to bring peace to Afghanistan, defeat the terrorists, quote unquote, once and for all, and try to create a more functional, more open, more successful society? And we have tried to do a version of that really since 9/11. And we're about to once again ramp up to some extent what it is we do. I actually think the more ambitious policy, however desirable, is bound to fail. Given the realities of Afghanistan, where often tribal loyalties are more profound than national loyalties, where Pakistan is providing a physical sanctuary for the Taliban to operate out of. But this is a perfect example of how ambitious should we be, how ambitious do we need to be, because we do have interest there. We learned the hard way on 9/11 that what goes on in Afghanistan can have consequences for us, but how should we pitch our foreign policy? And I would simply say that we need to find middle areas in this part of the world between trying to do too little and too much, between ignoring the place or trying to transform it. But that is exactly what the conversation is going to be tonight and tomorrow, based upon what the president is talking about tonight. In Europe, I would simply say what we want to do is push back against Russia. The goal is not to humiliate Mr. Putin. The goal is not to isolate him, but the goal is to make sure that he understands that he can't reintroduce Russian influence through the barrel of a gun. And I would think that means providing the Ukrainian people the ability to defend themselves. I think it means strengthening NATO, so Mr. Putin is not tempted to do anywhere else what he did in Ukraine, and he's done in some other places. I also think it means the United States working with the European Union. The president favored Brexit. He flirted with nationalists in France, and I think it's just a terrible idea. European Union, along with NATO, have been one of the two great foundation stones of stability in Europe. Europe is still a quarter of the world's economy, one of the principal theater of 20th century history. We do not want it to become a principal theater of 21st century history. In Asia, complicated. The relationship with China will probably be the single most important relationship of this century. If the Franco-German relationship was at the center of the first half of the 20th century, and the US-Soviet relationship was at the center of the second half of 20th century history, the US-China relationship will be at the center of much of 21st century history. So working this out, working out a positive relationship with China with bilateral, regional, and global issues where we learn to cooperate as well as compete. And when we compete, we try to limit the competition and limit its fallout on the areas of potential cooperation, will probably be the great diplomatic challenge of this era. It's going to be tested immediately, obviously, with North Korea. And we can talk about this at great length. But North Korea is another example of a world in disarray. Why? Well, one of the principles of this world over the last 40 or 50 years has been to stop the spread of nuclear weapons and stop the spread of ballistic missiles. Well, here is North Korea. Despite decades and decades of international sanctions and international diplomatic efforts, North Korea has nonetheless managed now to produce nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And I think there's only essentially three options. There is to attack it. New York Times had a front page story about that today, a so-called preventive military strike. It's an option. The problem with a preventive attack, though, is you can't always destroy what you know about. You certainly can't destroy what you don't know about. And then the question is, how does North Korea react? How do they retaliate? And it's quite possible that hundreds of thousands of people could die in the retaliation if North Korea decided to launch a second Korean War. We have 28,500 American troops there. We have a commitment to do what is ever necessary to provide for South Korea's defense. It's also intimately tied with Japan's defense and the entire future of the Asia-Pacific. So the option of using military force is real, but it is, as they say, consequential. The second option is to live with it. Say, we don't much like it, but we've lived with other countries that have developed nuclear weapons, and we can live with this. But that means you'd have to put your faith in deterrence, that you would have to think that rationality would constantly inform North Korean decision-making. You'd add your missile defense, but then you'd have to be confident that your missile defense would work all the time. 90% is not good enough when it comes to nuclear weapons. And you'd have to decide whether this was a situation you could manage and whether countries like Japan and others would feel sufficiently secure that they would not feel compelled to develop nuclear weapons of their own. Because the only thing that's far more characterized by disarray than the world we have is a world where several of North Korea's neighbors decide to go nuclear or several of Iran's neighbors decide to go nuclear in the Middle East. However bad it is now, it would be a picnic now compared to what the alternative would be. Are there any other options between essentially swallowing it or going to war with it? There possibly is one with diplomacy. To take an attempt to put a freeze or a limit on North Korea. I have no idea if they will accept it. Not clear exactly what we would have to offer to get there. China, however, has supported this approach, and I would simply say it's one worth exploring, if only because the alternatives are so unattractive. So if I were advising, I would say let's take a run at diplomacy. Let's see if we can't not solve the problem, but at least put a lid on it, one we could live with. If that works, great. If that doesn't work, then we can make the truly difficult and truly consequential choice between going to war or accepting the fact that North Korea is a nuclear power with an increasing ability to deliver them against us. At the global level, there's any number of things we need to do to try to narrow the gap between these global challenges and what's in place. And I would just simply say that in every area, we want to try to work with other countries, whether it's climate, whether it's disease, whether it's cyber, about setting the rules of the road. And I don't think this is overly optimistic, because one of the interesting things about living in a global age is if we can't be a giant gated community, nobody else can either. Everybody's potentially vulnerable. Everyone else's security and stability and economy and the rest is affected by what goes on beyond their borders. So I think the idea of working out some common understandings about what ought to be the rules of the road for managing globalization and building new institutions, new arrangements for coping with them, I don't think is pie in the sky. Difficult, yes, but impossible, no. Last but not least, we will not succeed in any of this, in doing what I talked about in the Middle East and Europe and Asia and dealing at the global level if we don't deal with ourselves. Disarray at home in this country will undermine our ability to reduce disarray in the world. And what I said before about the Middle East applies writ large. The world doesn't sort itself out by itself. It needs, we can't do it alone. Unilateralism is not an answer, but the world can't do it without us. It doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't have the consensus, it doesn't have the habits, it doesn't have the experience. American participation, often American leadership, is essential, but we are divided. I mean, Charlottesville was the most recent painful example, but we've been divided for years. The inability to get much of anything passed through the Congress. We saw it poison relations between the Congress and the Obama presidency. We're seeing it in this one, so it's not simply a matter of party, but the political dysfunctionality that now characterizes our system is profound. But I also think we've made things more difficult. I think our opposition to global trade agreements is truly short-sighted. It threatens our ability to continue to export. Imports are good, by the way. They give us choice. They give us cheaper goods. They introduce quality. If anyone thinks Detroit would be producing the kind of cars it's producing now, had it not faced the competition from Japan or Europe, you're kidding yourselves. But most important, even though trade on occasion, imports on occasion cost American jobs, the real threat to millions and millions of American jobs is not cheap imports from China or anywhere else. It's not American CEOs deciding to offshore their plants. The real threat to the future of our economy is automation. It's robotics, it's artificial intelligence, it's autonomous vehicles, so-called driverless trucks, driverless cars, and the like. So we can shut our borders to imports, but we can't shut our borders to technological advance. So the serious conversation about our economy ought not to be about protectionism, shutting down trade. It ought to be, how do we prepare the American workforce for the reality that many existing jobs will no longer exist, but the skill set that workers have is not adequate in order to prepare them so they can meet the demands of the jobs that will come into existence. Now, that's a serious conversation. That is a conversation worthy of this country. We have not begun that conversation. Or take immigration. Again, immigrants are not causing the disappearance of most jobs. Again, it's technology. To the contrary, if you look at the Fortune 100, look how many of the CEOs are either immigrants or the children of immigrants in the technology sphere and elsewhere. Immigration has been one of the great engines of American economic excellence. So we shut down high-skilled immigration at our peril. I could go on with other examples of disarray and really depress you, but again, my point is simply that we have got to put our own house in order if there's any chance of putting the world in order. I want to leave you with one last thought, because there's a lot of people who say, well, that's all great, but we can't afford it. Actually, we can. If you look at everything now we spend on defense, and you add in intelligence and homeland security and diplomacy, it comes to roughly 3.5% of our GDP, which is a lot. Our GDP is $18 trillion a year, so this is a serious chunk of change. But it's only about half the level percentage of our economy, of our economic output that we were spending for the decades of the Cold War. And my point is simply that we can do what we need to do in the world. We can afford it without in any way undermining our domestic well-being. We proved that during the Cold War, where we kept the Cold War cold for 4 decades. We kept the world largely safe. At the same time, we had extraordinary economic success here at home. This argument that you've got to choose between guns and butter is simply wrong. The answer is, again, you've got to have both. Because, again, what happens out there won't stay there. My favorite line is, the world is not Las Vegas. It won't stay there. It will come here. But the good news is we can afford to deal with it in a way that does not weaken our ability to provide the kind of standard of living or the jobs or the quality of life we want here at home. To the contrary, we've got to have guns and butter. And again, the good news is that we can. So the relationship between the political order here at home and the political order out in the world is organic in both directions. Bad things out there will complicate things here, and bad things here will get in the way of our ability to sort things out there. So we actually, if you think of national security, one last image, it's a coin, and it's got two sides. It's got a foreign policy side, and it's got a domestic policy side. And we've got to get both sides right. And in recent years, we haven't. In recent years, I would argue we've gotten both sides wrong. And that's what led me to write this book, because I am genuinely worried. My argument is that you should be worried too. And we have got to get the arrows pointing in the right direction, or the future of the world, and as a result, the future of this country will be nowhere close to its potential. So let me leave it with that, and let me open it up to any comments or questions you might have. Thank you. Sure. And I'll do my best to repeat questions that you can't hear, because there's not a microphone running around.
There's a book called The Accidental Superpower that takes a different slant on what you just said, and I'd just like your comments on it. They argue that we no longer have, and you commented on this, we no longer have the power or wealth to get the world out of disarray. And what we should do is keep on trading, but gradually pull back to within our own borders, cultivate a very strong relationship with Canada, with its resources and temperate climate, cultivate a good relationship with Mexico, with its labor, and in 30 to 50 years, we'll once again emerge as the world's lead superpower, and we'll be the only country self-sufficient in energy and food. Any merit in that?
Well, there's merit to the argument that we ought to have better relations with Mexico and Canada, because they're our two of our three largest trading partners, and they're also intimately tied to our security, because borders don't necessarily mean that much, which is why this renegotiation of NAFTA is so critical, and I hope it goes well. But again, if you add up the United States, Mexico, and Canada, we're what, 325 million people? Mexico adds, what, another 100, 125 million? So the three of us together are just under 500 million. This is in a world now, what, 7, 8 billion? Even our combined GDP is only about 20% of the world's. So we're just not enough. And as I said, we could be nice and happy and prosperous among ourselves, but meanwhile, North Korea is doing its thing, and a disease breaks out there, or China's doing its thing, or there's terrorists in the Middle East doing their thing. So that's just a giant gated community. So what that argues essentially is, okay, instead of having a gated US, we'll have a gated North America. The same flaws apply. It's just not so again, I'm all in favor of a better relationship here in North America. I think it's a great idea in the Americas more broadly, and there's real opportunities. I think a lot of what I said was pretty negative. Latin America, in many cases, is one of the more positive parts of the world of late. Think about it. There's no wars between states. We're not worried about terrorism. We're not worried about nuclear proliferation in the Americas. We've got problems in Venezuela, Central America, Mexico, I understand. But more countries than not are moving in the direction of more market-oriented and democratic. So we ought to be expanding our economic and other relations in this part of the world. But that would be a good basis for us dealing with the rest of the world, not a basis for us shutting ourselves off from the rest of the world. That's not a serious option. Sir.
North Korea, if they were to launch, let's go 9 months forward, a little more technology, a little more practice. If they were to launch 10 or 15 missiles at the same time, can we take them all out? If they were to launch anything at or wall, should we take it down? And how stable is their remit?
Well, a couple things. The questions are really about North Korea, about the stability of their leader, about what we would do under certain scenarios where they were to launch missiles either at us, at Guam, or anybody. My first statement is I don't think North Korea is going to shoot missiles at us. I think it's unlikely. I can't rule it out. But my own view is North Korea, and it's very hard, look, let me just take a step back. It's very hard to make confident statements about North Korea because it's the most closed country on the planet. But think about if you were North Korea. What have we seen in recent years? We've seen Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons after the end of the Cold War, and Ukraine gets invaded by Russia. We see Gaddafi give up all of his weapons of mass destruction. United States and France and others invade, get rid of him. Saddam Hussein, whatever weapons of mass destruction he had, he gave up. He was then moved out of power. So if you're North Korea, you may make the not irrational decision that giving up nuclear weapons can be bad for your political health. And that having nuclear weapons is a form of security. So I just posit and second of all, they know if they start shooting off their nuclear weapons, that they will disappear from the face of the earth. You won't just have regime change, you would have decimation of a society. So unless they are suicidal, I don't think they are likely to do it. Now, I can't rule it out. And this is, the leader of North Korea is incredibly cruel. Millions of North Koreans have died at the hands of their own leadership since the country came into existence. There's been slow motion genocide in that country. So you have to, I think it's a fair question, and the U.S. National Security Advisor asked it publicly on television a week ago when General McMaster was on George Stephanopoulos' show. And he basically was thinking out loud, saying, I don't know if the normal rules or patterns of deterrence apply here. And there will be people who will say, we can't trust them to apply here because we can't trust their rationality. Okay. So if they were, but in any case, if they were to shoot things, then I think it gets a lot simpler what it is you do. I think the much bigger question is they have things but don't shoot them. And that gets back to the basic quandary about whether you do a preventive military strike simply because you don't trust it, living with this kind of mutual vulnerability, because you can never be sure that missile defense works 100%. Never can be sure of that. There's no such thing as invulnerability in this world. You can reduce vulnerability. You can never be confident you're invulnerable. And then you just have to weigh your options about whether you're prepared to live with risk or you're prepared to live with the almost certain costs of starting a war with them. And look, these are terrible choices. There's a lesson in this. We first had this conversation about what to do with North Korea and at the first signs of its nuclear program in the early 90s under the Clinton administration. At the time, I wrote an article for the New York Times. Brent Scowcroft wrote one for the Washington Post, advocating that we use military force to nip this program in the bud. And it was discussed by the Clinton administration. And it was ultimately the people decided against it for fear it would cause a war on the peninsula, which is obviously something we didn't want and our South Korean ally did not want. But here we are 25 years later and things have not improved. To the contrary, they've grown decidedly worse. Foreign policy is many things. It's not analogous to red wine. It does not get better if you put it down and come back to it 25 years later. The choices are awful, but not acting is every bit as consequential as acting. So you've got to choose. And my guess is either we've got to try to negotiate our way out of it, we've got to manage it with missile defense and deterrence, or we're going to have to attack it. And that's the choice, I would think. It could well be the most fateful foreign policy choice of this president, likely to be the most fateful foreign policy choice of this president. And it gets very close to this question of risk tolerance. And we're moving in that direction to have to make what I think will be a truly fateful decision. Sir, in the back. Yes.
Do you think that the current president and the State Department, which appears very diminished in the last 6 or 7 months, are capable of dealing with these
Well, look, the answer, do I feel that this president and the State Department are capable? Look, you've only got one president at a time and one government at a time. I think there are some capable individuals there serving in this administration. For the life of me, I do not understand why so many senior level positions are going unfilled. The idea that the Secretary of State would not benefit from the advice and experience of literally hundreds, if not thousands of individuals is to me baffling. Or you take when a Republican president, as you did in this case, won, there was an entire Republican foreign policy establishment. Problem was about 150 many of whom were the more prominent members of that establishment, decided to write letters criticizing candidate Trump. All of them have been precluded from serving. So most of the Republican veterans or experienced hands who would have gone into a Republican administration are sitting on the sidelines. And then I think the president makes the problem worse with his tweeting and the fact that a lot of what he does is not cleared. And tweets are White House statements. They ought to be treated with the same degree of formality and seriousness as any other White House statement. You've got too many centers of decision making. You had the awful thing where he went to Europe. The speech was prepared. It was approved by the National Security Council. And then at the last minute, several people close to the president got to him and he changed the content of the speech, and references to our commitments under the NATO treaty were deleted. You can't have that. You can't have more than one formal process at the time. You can't have informal processes that undermine it. You can't have people who are not in the formal process. I think it's good that Mr. Bannon is now a private citizen. And I think but I think the president has to come to realize, if he is going to be a successful president, that decision-making processes and characteristics that may have worked for him in his previous life will not carry over well into this life. And I don't know if he's prepared to make that decision and stick with it. So we'll see. But I'll say one other thing. I sure hope the answer to your question is yes, because this is about as difficult an inbox. Think of what we've talked about tonight. Everything from a resurgent Russia to an unraveling Middle East to a North Korean nuclear weapon to climate change to disease to cyber, you name it. If there was ever a time you needed a competent presidency, this is it. This is as tough. There's more difficult issues coming at us now than at any time, I think, in the modern era, in the post-World War II era. So the premium on orderly, professional decision-making is high, and I think the president is making a difficult situation much more so by not having staffed it completely and by not running nearly as orderly a ship as he should run. Sir.
One of the major changes in the world over the past year has been the emergence.
Whoops. I'm sorry, is what?
The emergence in France of a candidate who takes on all the parties and doesn't just get elected, but creates a whole new party. And our friends in France tell us has lifted the whole mood of the country. He still has to take on the unions, but my question is, do you think that's just a one-off in France? Do you think that's a model that other countries might emulate?
For those of you who couldn't hear it, the question is, can what happened in France, where essentially an outsider came in and created a movement, a de facto party, a third party, we would say, and succeeded? I'd say a couple of things. The short answer is probably not, or President Bloomberg would now be well into the first year of his presidency. Very, very difficult here, given the power of the parties, given, for example, the way we organize who participates in debates. It really is a bipartisan, shall we say, stranglehold. And then if no one gets a majority of the electoral votes, it gets put into the House of Representatives, where, again, the parties have all the advantages. So I think it's extraordinarily difficult for a third party candidate to become president. And again, lots of people have looked at it, and third-party candidates can influence who becomes president much more than they can become president. And also in the case of Monsieur Macron, his numbers have been plummeting. Very interesting. So, what it takes to succeed at campaigning is often fundamentally different than what it takes to succeed at governing. And it's not clear to me he can succeed at governing. I certainly hope he does, because if he doesn't, I think we're going to have a whole resurgence of populism in France, and it's bad for France, and it's bad for Europe. But just putting that aside, he has the very difficult challenge of working with the unions, trying to roll back the state. The size of the public sector in France is enormous, yet you have so many people who want the benefits. It's very similar in this country, where the rolling back entitlements is not the most popular position for a candidate for public office to take, but we need to roll back or at least reform entitlements in this country if if our debt is not going to get the best of us. But I think it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Macron to govern, given the challenges he faces, given the lack of a real political base in the French Parliament. But no, I don't see it as analogous here. What you can have, though, is someone like Donald Trump, which is, how would I put it? He's a third-party candidate who ran as a Republican. So the question for me going forward, particularly in the Democratic Party this time, or a Republican Party down the road, or whether you have people who do not come through the traditional path and enter into politics more, and you can see it it would be surprising to me if you did not have some non-traditional candidates enter the Democratic presidential primary process this time around. And it's even possible that a Donald Trump will be challenged by Republicans, some of whom may not be traditional politicians. But I don't see powerful third-party movements, just given the way the playing field is significantly tilted against third-party candidacies in this country at the presidential level, less so at the state and local level. Sir.
Could you comment a little bit about the role of the CIA in terms of intelligence gathering, effectiveness, and covert operations problem solving?
The question is, can I talk about the CIA intelligence analysis and covert operations? Very little, as you would expect. Look, intelligence analysis is incredibly important. I thought, this, in terms of helping policymakers understand what the situation is, the background to things. You want a good relationship between intelligence and policymakers. Not that the policymakers influence intelligence, but you want it to be a close relationship so people in the intelligence community know what's relevant, know what kinds of issues are being teed up, where they can make a difference. I think in my experience, the quality of analysis is pretty good, though you sometimes get it wrong. The community was wildly wrong on whether Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And it shows what, like any other organization, it's vulnerable to groupthink, to not questioning assumptions. And there's been some interesting reforms introduced since. But look, intelligence analysis is an art, it's not a science. You're always dealing with incomplete information. You're dealing with imperfect information. Sometimes you don't know what's imperfect. But you've got to give your best. You can say, I'm 80% confident of X or Y or something like that. That's kind of what you do. I found it pretty useful as a policymaker. Covert operations are usually exaggerated in what they can accomplish. The movies would lead you to believe that tremendous things can be accomplished. It's usually more at the margins or at the edges. But look, my view is we need a strong intelligence community. In many cases, particularly in something like terrorism, when very actionable intelligence, this is our best defense. By the time people are mounting an operation of something, it's too late. Then you're into how do you limit the damage. What you want to do is discover the individuals or discover the planning and stop it in its tracks. So the investment we make in intelligence, I don't know, it must be about plus or minus 10% of what we invest in our military right now, I think is a great investment. It's dollar for dollar, probably in the case of terrorism, the single best investment we can make. And it's something like North Korea, the analysis that we make about their capabilities. And well, I don't know if you saw about a week ago, there was the story that North Korea's moved much more quickly than we would have thought because they had access to a certain firm in Ukraine that was accelerating their missile program. It's that kind of thing. You never want your you don't want your policymakers going about making policy to North Korea, assuming, for example, we got 3 years to head this off, when it turns out we may only have 8 months to head it off. It's that kind of thing. So it really is important. And the track record, like anything else, it's uneven, but it's essential. Let's see if I can get some diversity in this conversation. I only see men with blue shirts. Yes, ma'am.
Could you comment on what you think our options are relating to Russia under its current leadership?
Sure. The question is, what are our options towards Russia? Look, let me make a statement about Russia. I think Mr. Putin is a spoiler. And his goal is not to make Russia great again, because to make Russia great again, he'd have to have a real economy and a real political process. He can't afford that. That's too risky to his political base, to his cronies, and the way he runs Russia. What he wants is Russia to be seen as great again, to be seen as a great power, to be respected. And he's got a couple of tools. To some extent energy, but less so, because international energy markets have so changed because of what's going on in this country. But he's got cyber, and he's got military force. And so he's a force to be reckoned with. So my view is, let's reckon with him. And if we can partner with him in limited ways in the Middle East, fine. If we can't, then we push back. If we have to push back in Europe, as I suggested, strengthening NATO, strengthening Ukraine, we should do it. But we should also be talking to him. Like the other day, Russia voted with us, as did China, on ramping up dramatically the sanctions against North Korea. We're working on some limited tactical ceasefires in Syria. So it's one of these complicated relationships that it's not all or nothing. You got big areas, so it's in some ways the same challenge as with China, though I don't mean to compare the two countries because they're fundamentally different. But I mean that it's not a one-dimensional relationship. It's a multiple personality relationship. And what we've got to do is try to encourage certain behaviors, discourage others, and try to protect the areas of limited cooperation at the same time we push back against the things we don't like. So I think it's complicated. And my view is he'll be there a long time. You know, my former colleague Bob Gates once opined that he thought the only way Mr. Putin would leave power is feet first. And you know, we are likely going to have to deal with Mr. Putin's Russia for a long time to come. So, you know, my view is not to demonize him in the sense of, you know, not to ignore him, not to try to humiliate him, but to work with him on terms we can live with. And I think it'll be difficult because in some cases he's learned some bad lessons, and in some cases he's willing to do things like in the Middle East that we may not, and that's going to give him a degree of influence and leverage. But I would invest time with him. I would be comfortable having serious envoys sit with him and try to work things out. To the extent he wants respect and the visibility we should give him that. I mean, I don't think I've never thought that talking with people and showing them respect is a sign of weakness or a favor we do for others. This is just one tool of how you go about national security policy. Sir.
Could you lay out a few scenarios for how the world might evolve over the next 4 or 5 years?
That's a really interesting question. Can I give a couple of scenarios about how the world might evolve over the next? Well, sure. I think one, I guess I could put it on two scales or spectrum. I mean, one would just simply be how there's a kind of a pessimistic one where the disarray really continues to grow. And you have a breakdown of trading relationships. The NAFTA renegotiation doesn't go well. There's virtually no progress in dealing with global issues from cyber to climate. the North Korea situation ends up as either a war or as a North Korea with a large and growing number of nuclear weapons on long-range missiles. And I could spin out another 10 problems. India, China, situation there deteriorates. Iran, Saudi Arabia, situation there deteriorates. Russia, Ukraine, situation there. So I can be as dark as you want. But none of the, look, the good news is none of that's inevitable. And I could also imagine a situation where we put a ceiling on things with North Korea, and we avoid the emergence of them with long-range missiles that they're confident in, and we avoid a war. Nothing happens with the South China Sea, or any incidents that happen don't grow into something more. India, China, things stand down. Middle East, this whole thing about Qatar and the Saudis and the UAE again calms down. We make a little bit of progress dealing with some global issues. NAFTA gets successfully renegotiated. We figure out a way to do some other things in the trade space. So that would be at the positive end of things. And there's everything in between. So it's just too many variables. But I think what's interesting about that is a lot has to do with us. A lot still has to do with the choices the United States makes and how it goes about. So what I'm hoping is that this administration reconsiders some of the things it's said and done, and is just very careful about some of the decisions it makes. For example, one thing I hope the president does not do is take the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal. I don't much like the deal. It wasn't the deal I would have negotiated, but it's the only deal we've got. If we take ourselves out of it, we're going to isolate ourselves, not Iran. Iran would then be free to go resume its certain activities, which it stopped doing. And I would have thought we have enough on our hands dealing with North Korea and everything else we've talked about tonight without adding Iran, putting that back on the front burner. It's a very different future if the president does that, and we'll know probably within a couple of months whether he's going to do that. Very different future if he launches a preventive military strike against North Korea. If the NAFTA talks crash on some of the positions we put forward, the U.S. trade rep put forward the other day about content in automobiles. So there's so much that could go either way. I don't quite know how to, but there is a sense that there's a lot on the table. And what I think Mr. Trump has done, and the fact that you can have this conversation in your question, is there's much fewer givens now, much harder to make assumptions. So in previous American presidents, you could have asked me that question, and I could have given you an answer that was pretty bounded. And I think that's what's so interesting now is it's a much less bounded answer. The range of potential choices and outcomes is greater now than at any time since World War II. Or if you like sporting metaphors, every president from Truman through Obama was basically within the 40-yard lines of the foreign policy field. We are now in the end zone. And it's a very different set of choices and potential consequences for the United States and the world. I only see guys in blue shirts. What's going on here tonight? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Pardon me? Well, that's a great, yeah, I mean, the question of what citizens can do. You know, it's a question, by the way, that we've been debating around our dinner table. We debated in my workplace. I've got about 325 employees. We're at the Council on Foreign Relations, debating it in my synagogue. We're debating it in the country. Whether it's reactions to Charlottesville or it's reactions to the things we're talking about tonight, if you disagree with where things are heading and so forth, what is it you do? I'll be honest, it's harder in the foreign policy world than it is in some of the others. If you're interested in some other issues, I think mayors, governors, whatever, but even there, if you have strong views about climate change, well, what mayors and governors do will have tremendous impact on climate change, or what corporations do. And it's often less difficult to influence mayors and governors and firms you work at or firms you invest in than it is the federal government. There's Congress. It's easier often to reach your congressman than it is your Secretary of State or your national security advisor. So I think there are things you can do, but I'm not going to exaggerate it in the foreign policy world. I think there's things you can do that are significant but have a longer term consequence, and this gets close to my favorite subject, which is one of the reasons that I think this country often makes suboptimal foreign policy choices, is a lot of us don't have the educations in the background to weigh the options being put forward to us. And one of the reasons so many of us don't have the backgrounds and the knowledge to weigh the options being suggested to us is it's not taught in our schools. So you can graduate high school and college, even elite universities, and you can essentially be illiterate when it comes to understanding history and civics and international relations. Yes, it's offered on campus, but virtually no school in America requires that you study these things. So one of the things one can do in order to make, over time, I think, change the context in which foreign policy is debated, is change what it is offered and what it is required that students study at our high schools and colleges and universities in this country. But it should be our goal that no person emerges, say, with a BA, without understanding the basics of American political culture, the American political tradition, and without understanding the basics of the world they're going to enter, and the relationship between the world and the United States and the United States and the world. A fundamental level of literacy about our political tradition, a fundamental level of literacy about the world. That's within our power to require, and if that were to happen, the quality of conversation and debates in this country about our role in the world, I believe, would fundamentally change. I see a hand there. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak, given what you just said, can you speak to the parallels between the Weimar Republic and where we are today in the United States?
About the parallels between Weimar and us? I don't see very many parallels at all. Indeed, I think one of the interesting and optimistic things of the United States over the last 7, 8 months is the pushback against the president. And I don't mean this in a partisan way, but this president has espoused many policies and said many things that are outside the political mainstream. And you see the courts pushing back on the immigration and homeland security issues. You see the media investigating all sorts of things. You see mayors doing what they're doing. The other day we saw CEOs doing what they're doing. What I think it shows is the strength of American society, that we really do have a decentralization of power in this country, and the presidency is just that. It's a presidency, but it's limited within the government, and it's limited, and what the writ of government is limited, or federal government is limited by state and local governments, by civil society, by companies, and so forth. So I think that's something that people ought to take heart from. And again, I don't mean that in the partisan way, but the strength and the breadth and depth of American society, to me, has been demonstrated. And that Weimar and other societies didn't have that. They were thin. If you look at what's going on in modern Turkey, what you see is a president there who's systematically destroying everything I've just talked about, all the independent institutions in the society. He's even destroying the bureaucracy, where you have independent officials, and you see it with the media, you see it with business, and so forth. And that's how you destroy. We're not seeing that. I think what we're seeing, if anything, is we're seeing a lot of parts of civil society energized. Ironically enough, a lot of people who couldn't be bothered to vote in a presidential election are now seeing the consequences of an election, and I think are much more politically active. And I think in the long run that bodes well for this society. I think, I never like it when basically 40% of those who can vote in a presidential election don't bother to. So I like the fact that Americans are seeing the politics of consequences, and that maybe this will lead them to get better informed and more active. In the long run, that would be very healthy. How are we doing? Okay, let's get a guy in a blue shirt. I don't want to discourage. There we go, right there.
One comment. response to the previous speaker, I've been 3 assignments in Asia, North Asia, for the last 30 years. We were appalled, and sitting as a governor with AmCham in Hong Kong, we were appalled at the deterioration in the experience level in the State Department, and particularly in the last 10 years. You had governors, you had senators, you had congressmen, you had mayors come through, and there was a significant deterioration from my own observation. Come to the question. You have used the word international sheriff, I think, in previous book of yours. At what point will China start to exert its influence in that regard? It has the economic strength, it now has the military strength. I don't think it has the understanding yet, but they're going to do it.
Well, I'm actually a contrarian about China. And the idea that somehow China is going to take America's role or fill America's shoes, I just don't see happening. Because for China, too much of what China does is to keep the party in place, to avoid unemployment and threats, what they see to political stability. So China can't do certain things in the world. It can't take on a certain role because it would be too threatening to the nature of the political order at home. So I think the real alternative to a US-led world is not a China-led world or a Russia-led world. It's a nobody-led world. The real alternative to a US-led world, which is essentially what we've had now since World War II, first during the Cold War and then certainly for the quarter of a century since, the real alternative to that is a world where nobody leads. And a world where nobody leads is not a happy place. It's a messy place. And we've seen it in the Middle East. We're seeing elements of it in Asia and Europe. Maybe the EU will step up a little bit there. We're seeing it at the global level where so much is, where the gap between the challenges and the responses in many cases is growing. But no, China is not it doesn't have the mindset, it doesn't have the experience. China wants many of the benefits of globalization without really participating in it. It's too much of a threat to the primacy of the party, to the political leadership. So so China's ability to play a global, so Xi Jinping can go to Davos, but that doesn't make you a global leader. And so again, I'm less worried about the threat or challenge from China than I am the threat we pose to ourselves. And the real challenge or threat to the world that has benefited so much is us. That we essentially grow tired of it or don't understand its benefits that it is conveyed on us or conferred on us, and that we exaggerate the costs of American global leadership and we underestimate the benefits. And that is the real danger to the world that we have all, I believe, benefited from. Thank you very much.